It looks okay so far.
Very much for the invitation. I do see some friends in the audience, Fabrice and Melanie, who I have met at different times at Glasgow over the last decade or so. So I'm very sorry I'm not in Paris today, but you know, I am absolutely thrilled to be invited to speak to the Sorbonne, you know, and speak about some of my research on James Watt. I mean, it's attracted some headlines over the last year, this research, especially in 13th of June 2020, during the Global Lives conversation about Black Lives Matter. James Watt, the inventor and the great improver of the steam engine, he was publicly added to the list of icons whose historic connections with transatlantic slavery were exposed. So this Times article, which was headlined, James Watt, father of the age of steam, sold slaves, it came as a shock to many. But my research, what had underpinned this revelation, went back almost 3 years. For this was part of the research for the report Slavery, Abolition in the University of Glasgow in 2017, that I identified that Watt was involved alongside his father in colonial commerce in Greenock in the west of Scotland. So having initially in microfilms, I later went to the much more voluminous holdings in the Library of Birmingham Archives and Collections, where the Watt family papers are stored. So the archive revealed that James Watt was not just a beneficiary of his father, who was an enslaver and a merchant, but he also had a much more direct role. And I'll discuss this in turn. The research was published in the collection James Watt, Culture, Innovation, Enlightenment in 2020 by Liverpool University Press, and it was then picked up by the Times. I was advised that, I mean, there is a real fascination at the moment, a public fascination in Great Britain with connections to colonial slavery. I was advised that this James Watt story became a splash in all UK editions of the Times. I mean, to me, this was surprising. You know, that the book chapter was pretty standard. It showed typical practices of mid-scale colonial merchants and traffickers and enslaved people in the British Atlantic world. But perhaps I underestimated just how much that Watt is still celebrated across the United Kingdom. And of course, the findings took on new significance in the Black Lives Matter environment. Given his unique footprint across the UK, this new awareness of Watt's role in colonial slavery, it presents an issue how he is represented and commemorated, given there is this ongoing discussion, a global discussion about how historical figures, almost exclusively dead white men, are celebrated in public space. So this seminar today does two things. I mean, I will trace the history and the story of James Watt rise in Atlantic context. And then I will pose some questions in comparative context about commemoration, celebration, and anniversaryism, especially in light of the BLM movement. Like most historians, I pass no moral judgment in the actions of past individuals. I'm simply here to provide objective analysis of the evidence. Similarly, I'm not here to tell institutions or authorities what they should do with figures that are commemorated in public space. And there are very many of them about James Watt. Well, firstly, I think as an introduction, I will outline the glorious narrative of James Watt. I mean, this is how he has been represented in biographies, contemporary and modern. James Watt was born in Greenock in 1736. His father, James Watt Sr., was described in family biographies as a shipwright, a ship's chandler, who supplied vessels with nautical apparatus, stores and instruments. He was a builder and a merchant. I mean, this is a quote from a family biography by J.P. Muirhead, The Life of Watt. We know that that word merchant covers up a multitude of sins. It does a lot of heavy lifting in this context, because a merchant could have a multitude of roles across the Atlantic world, which I'll come on to elucidate. So James Watt resided in Greenock until he was 17. When his mother died, he travelled along the River Clyde to Glasgow to work under his uncle, who was also a merchant. He spent a year in London in 1755, where he undertook training as a mathematical instrument maker, for which his father paid, I think, around 20 guineas for 9 months instruction. I mean, this 20 guineas is a substantial sum of money, which again, I'll come back to. Watt returned permanently to Scotland around September 1756. His connection with Old College, which is now the University of Glasgow, is that he cleaned astronomical instruments for the university. These instruments had been gifted to the University of Glasgow by an Alexander McFarlane, who was an enslaver in Jamaica, a planter, and he was also Old College alumnus. So he gifted these magnificent instruments, which led to the establishment of the McFarlane Observatory, which was the first of its type in Great Britain. So this was the start of Watt's career. He ultimately relocated to the university precinct in a role analogous to a modern university technician. He hadn't attended the university, but he became technical staff. He also operated simultaneously his father's mercantile business. He sold maritime instruments. He had ventured into map making, publishing, and he did surveying work. Around 1763, John Anderson, who was a professor in natural philosophy, and of course the founder of the University of Strathclyde, he asked Watt to repair Newcomen's steam engine. In the experimentation, James Watt had the idea for separate condensation, and this led Watt to discover the latent heat of steam, although he didn't understand the science behind it at the time. Subsequent discussions with other Old College staff, particularly Joseph Black, clarified his understandings. So he obtained a patent in 1769 for what became the steam engine. He had to move to Birmingham. Watt was a very bad businessman. He had to move to Birmingham in 1774. He relocated permanently and took up with Matthew Boulton. He was a financier and industrialist who subsidised and helped develop the engine. The Boulton-Watt steam engine ultimately powered the cotton mills, which were, of course, the economic foundation of the first phase of British industrialisation from about the 1760s up to the 1830s. So, I mean, that's the narrative. And Glasgow University have memorialised them and celebrated them since in that context. James Watt connections with Glasgow did not end in 1774. He was recognised by the university with an honorary Doctor of Laws on the 15th of May, 1806. In response, Watt acknowledged the influence of the university had in his rise. He donated £300, and I quote, "entertaining a due sense of the many favours conferred upon me by the University of Glasgow, and to excite the spirit of inquiry and exertion in students of natural philosophy and chemistry, he donated a prize for £300. The commemoration of Watt has continued long after his death. In 1825, his son presented a marble statue of his father at the university, which is now displayed in the Hunterian Museum. And the institution also retained some of his early working models. Family biographies by the mid to late Victorian period were describing how there were pilgrimages to Old College, almost as if James Watt had become the patron saint of the Industrial Revolution. And I quote from a family biography by J.P. Muirhead: "That interesting little model, as altered by the hand of Watt and preserved in all safety and honour within the precinct of its ancient birthplace, has been appropriately placed beside the noble statue of the engineer in the Hunterian Museum, a sacred relic worthy of such a shrine, and there visited by many a worshipping pilgrim." So we do get an understanding here about, the hagiographical treatment that Watt is given in these biographies, and this really continues A half century later, the University of Glasgow commemorated Watt in 1901, which was the 9th Jubilee of the institution. By then, the University of Glasgow had moved to Gilmore Hill in the West End of Glasgow, its current location. Adam Smith and James Watt, both contemporaries and friends, they were chosen as individuals with historic connections to the institution to celebrate the illustrious past. Lord Kelvin, who was a famous mathematician and physicist, he eulogised Watt's rise and especially his time at Old College. He drew attention to the university's philosophers who had used the Old College's privileges to discover Watt, who was a genius. Kelvin praised his inventions, but also championed the university's role as a space for the disenfranchised. Because James Watt had not served an apprenticeship, he would have not been able to practice his trade under any other circumstance in the city of Glasgow because of the guild traditions. So the university offered him a space. He didn't have to have the actual qualification. He could just practice as the instrument maker. And the university celebrated this. The James Watt Engineering Building was opened in 1908 and extended in 1920. There's a new James Watt South Building in 1958. In 1921, the James Watt Chair was founded by the Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders, which continues to present day. Multiple museums have traced his story, including in Greenock, and his workshop has been created at the London Science Museum. Soho House in Birmingham tells the story of Matthew Boulton and the Lunar Society, which was a society of men who met, included Watt. These industrial philosophers who are the leading lights in the British Industrial Revolution. There is also at least one university, Heriot Watt, in Edinburgh, and some colleges that are named after him. There's statues in Glasgow, Greenock, Birmingham, Leeds, and elsewhere. It seems to me that outside of royalty, and probably only Queen Victoria herself, then James Watt is one of the most commemorated and celebrated figures in British history. But what I would say, I mean, this is the sanitised version. We have the James Watt's rise, and then he is memorialised in the university and elsewhere. But I would say there has been an absence of any real investigation into James Watt's family background in Greenock in Scotland and the connections with Atlantic commerce. I mean, of course, we would expect this type of lacuna in 19th century biographies commissioned by family. Some were commissioned by his son, and some were written by family members such as J.P. Muirhead. So in this sense, it is not surprising that West India connections were marginalised and any involvement with chattel slavery was simply ignored. However, this absence has continued into modern biographies. For example, the Reverend Dr. Richard Hills devoted an entire volume in 2002 to James Watt's time in Scotland. In the process, he referred to the West Indies, which was one of the initial hooks that got me interested where his father's business was. But Hills mentioned the West Indies, but disregards the slavery connection entirely. So there are 9 mentions of the West Indies in the book's index, but no investigation of the implications of the connections. Similarly, David Philip Miller's quite brilliant biography, The Life and Legend of James Watt in 2019, has a very good first chapter on the making of Watt in Scotland, in Glasgow and Greenock. Again, noting the West India connection, but there is no interrogation about the exposure of the family to slavery. So I think it's very fair to say that into the 21st century, social historians of science and technology have disregarded the imperial context in Glasgow and Scotland when examining Watt's trajectory as an inventor. I should say here that, I mean, I'm a very reluctant and unintentional scholar of Watt. In previous work, I have not been concerned with the culpability of single individuals. I'm much more interested in the effects of the system of slavery itself, particularly in regional development in Glasgow and Scotland more broadly. But this has naturally led into a few biographical studies of individuals and their roles. James Watt came into my view as I was researching the University of Glasgow slavery connections. And of course, I have already noted he donated this £300 in 1808. Basically, I was interested where did his money come from? Did he have longer connections to slavery out with his, industrial credentials? There has also been some debate in recent years if Watt's steam engines were sold to planters in the Caribbean, and this also attracted my interest. I began reading the Richard Hills book. They were mentioning, it mentioned the West Indies with his father's mercantile affairs. So it seemed to me that anyone operating as a merchant in mid-18th century Greenock and Glasgow, like James Watt Sr., would attract the attention of historians commissioned to examine the slavery connections of individuals and institutions. So then Dr. Malcolm Dick of the University of Birmingham simultaneously invited me to contribute a chapter to the Liverpool University chapter, which I've already mentioned. It was published in 2020. So really, I started to get into Watt in a way that I had never intended. And it became clear to me that Watt was much more complicit in mercantile commerce and chattel slavery than even I could have predicted. So the next few parts of this lecture will consider, in turn, James Watt Sr.'s mercantile affairs in the Atlantic world, James Watt himself in Scotland and Glasgow, the steam engine in slavery, and then the wider implications. So I would say that the mercantile business of James Watt Sr., his father, it was really key to unraveling the story. For it was clear to me that from the early 1730s, James Watt Sr. operated as a merchant, trading with other merchants in, the premier slave trading ports in England, Bristol and Liverpool. And he also was involved with the colonial trades out of Greenock and Glasgow for at least 20 years, 30 years. He developed long-term trading connections with enslavers in North America and the West Indies. For example, in August 1738, he commissioned a James Watson, a young Scotsman, to reside in North Carolina and trade in his behalf. This is known as the supercargo system. James Watt Sr. remained in Scotland. He sent out a young agent who would reside there semi-permanently and undertake the business. The business was dependent upon the export of goods from Scotland, such as textiles, and the import of produce grown by enslaved people, sugar, rum, and tobacco. The produce would be sent back to the ports of Clyde, and James Watt Sr. was dealing with merchants in Glasgow to sell the produce. So I would say that it began really as a modest enterprise, but it evolved from the Carolinas into the British West Indies. We know that the Watt Senior enterprise involved the purchase of ships. He was trading in Barbados and Antigua, selling commodities such as pork. I don't think that his principal focus would be the trafficking in enslaved people. I don't also, and neither do I think that the principal trade would have been grown produce. I think he was much more of a general merchant that was dealing a lot of everything. And that involved occasionally the trade in slave produce and the trafficking in enslaved people. Because the Watt family enterprise expanded into the Leeward Islands around 1739. I mean, and there is voluminous correspondence in Birmingham, good correspondence about mercantile affairs, about James Watt Sr.'s instructions to his supercargoes in Antigua and Barbados. It seemed to me he is always dealing with Scots, if preferred, if possible. And we know that these Scots operate in networks. It's about trust networks, of course. sometimes based on religion or you know, previous kinship relations. So he's sending out Scots he already knows and dealing with Scots when possible. We have voluminous correspondence about Andrew Cochrane. And it seemed to me, I traced some of the correspondence about the relationship, which endured for about 5 years. At times, Watt Senior was trigger happy with legal action, threatening his agents about, you know, he was very strict in enforcing his business. So what I would say, I mean, this to me, it started off as a small business and became much more significant. So it seems to me, given the extent of the business, and I think he was mid-scale, it's perhaps unsurprising that his representatives were involved in the intercolonial trafficking in enslaved people. We know there is correspondence that he sends his agents, James Watson, he sends them instructions to purchase rum, molasses, sugar, as well as 12 enslaved people in around 1740. This practice, or this is carried out in St. Christopher. They also go to the Dutch island of St. Eustatius, which was an entrepot for foreign traders. They dealt actually with French colonists, and they dealt with British slave traders on the island. There is also correspondence that the Watt family enterprise were involved in some trafficking between North Carolina and Jamaica. I mean, these are few examples. I didn't find any major, I don't think it was his principal focus was trafficking enslaved people. These seem to be incidental and occasional examples of a larger business, which was about general foodstuffs and slave-grown produce. So what I've just described here is, I mean, in isolation, these are fairly standard practices of Atlantic merchants. To me, this was very normal. There was the question a historian would ask here, so what? I mean, there is no so what. These are fairly banal, everyday practices by mid-scale Atlantic merchants. Commissioning young Scots as supercargoes to undertake colonial business, it revolves around these trades. However, when it does become significant, given the trajectory of the Watt family, the 2 generations that follow James Watt Senior, these activities then become very significant, especially as it became clear also that James Watt was involved with his father's business. Now we have the Atlantic world picture. I will move on to James Watt in Glasgow in Scotland. It became clear to me that James Watt acted as his father's mercantile agent throughout 1753. He acted sometimes for him in London in 1755, 56, and after he returned permanently to Glasgow in 1757. So we can actually tie James Watt to his father's enterprise with correspondence. He is represented in the biographies as a general merchant, which I think is true, but it also seemed to me that James Watt, the great improver, occasionally dealt in slave-grown produce. For example, on the 27th of September, 1756, he comes back from London and he noted a great error in the prices charged in the tobacco account. I don't think that he was at the upper echelons of colonial commerce in Glasgow, but it's certainly clear he was involved in selling slave-grown produce. We know that when he went to London, I don't think it was a particularly lucrative career either, because we know that he went to London in 1755. He was trained as a mathematical instrument maker, and his father paid us 20 guineas. Again, this becomes significant because this sum, James Watt's rise, has sometimes been represented as humble origins. I mean, this is a falsehood. This 20 guineas that his father paid is around 21 pounds sterling. For comparison, this sum was around 7 years' wages for a male servant in Lanarkshire around the mid-18th century. There is absolutely no way this was a rags to riches story. Instead, James Watt education in London was underwritten by his father. We know that. There is correspondence saying that. His father, of course, was a colonial merchant of long standing with extensive transatlantic interests. So when then James Watt comes back from London, he works with Old College from around 1757. He has a number of patrons who were amongst the leading figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. He maintained good relationship with John Anderson, the Professor of Natural Philosophy, Alexander Wilson, Joseph Black. I mean, he seems to be a fairly, although not university educated, Watt is thoroughly enmeshed in Enlightenment Glasgow, attending many clubs. And these connections provided him with employment opportunities, and it really built upon a tradition of practical assistance at Old College between craftsmen and professors. By 1757, Watt referred to himself as the mathematical instrument maker at the university. He was invited to clean, of course, the astronomical instruments, but he was invited to work in apparatus for classroom lectures. He attended some as an assistant, and in many ways he was self-learning here. You know, he was attending Old College as a technician and improving his own education. His important relationship was with James Black, a lecturer on chemistry in the mid-1750s, and he learned much about chemical science. And Black later recounted that he found Watt to be possessing most uncommon talents for mechanical knowledge and practice, with an originality, readiness, and piousness of invention. But what is now clear in the story is now apparent that James Watt was enmeshed in colonial commerce whilst actually working at Old College. Incidentally, Old College was then developing a reputation for abolitionist critique. In January 1762, James Watt's brother, who's known as Jockey, his name is John, but he comes back to Greenock from Bristol, which is of course a slave trading port. With him, I think it's possible he may have brought a black boy named Frederick, who was delivered from Greenock to the Glasgow merchant, John Warrand. The child was then to be delivered to the Brodies of Spiney, which are a gentry family near Forres, and the child would likely have been employed as a page boy in the country house. A receipt and a list of clothing survives for the young child. I have no idea where the young child came from. Perhaps he came from the James Watt Senior's representatives in North Carolina or the West Indies, and perhaps Bristol. But John Jockey sailed to Virginia in April 1762, and he actually drowned in the Caribbean. So it seems to me at this point, responsibility for the family enterprise passed to his brother, James Watt Jr., as we'll call him here. And this was one of the big discoveries, you know, and I had to check this letter again and again and again just to verify this, because this was the actual clinching piece of evidence that James Watt was involved on his own account with the trafficking in enslaved people. In October 1762, the gentry owner, James Bronte of Spiney, addressed a letter to James Watt Jr., merchant in Greenock, and he asked for an account of what Frederick has cost you since his arrival at Greenock. I am very sensible you have been at a great deal of trouble upon my account. So this seemed to me it was then the great improver, James Watt, and not his father, James Watt Senior, who had taken over the family business and was responsible for the costs incurred. So again, I mean, I read this letter again and again and again. I had to verify that this was in fact the case. James Watt's correspondence around this time also reveals it was in Glasgow, and it seems to me it was possible with the delivery. It's possible he was involved with the delivery to John Warrand. I actually think the child ran away too. I don't ever think he actually reached the gentry house. So what we're seeing here is that overall, the Watt family enterprise was involved in this trafficking in enslaved people. Certainly before chattel slavery was made illegal in Scotland with the Joseph Knight case in 1778. and James Watt, as we know, was involved. So I would say, I mean, historians are well versed in judging individuals by the standards of their time. There was no political movement to abolish the slave trade until 1787, but I would say that A System of Moral Philosophy by Francis Hutcheson was published in 1755, which was the first moral critique of chattel slavery. James Watt is involved in this group of philosophers at the time, including Hutcheson's protege, Adam Smith. I'm unsure if he knew anything about Hutcheson's work, but it seems to me unlikely that he knew nothing at all. What I will say is that later in 1791, James Watt passes private commentary to French merchants regarding Saint-Domingue. They were trying to order steam engines, and James Watt says, he replies, "We heartily pray that the system of slavery, so disgraceful to humanity, were abolished by prudent, though progressive, measures." Whether this makes James Watt an abolitionist is highly contentious, but he was certainly privately opposed to the continuation of slavery. This period is important as well because it's about 6 months before William Wilberforce, his first motion to abolish the slave trade, was defeated in the British Parliament. This gradual abolition position was a similar stance to Henry Dundas, whose introduction to gradual abolition in the House of Commons in April 1792 has gathered some attention. So Watt is certainly in that he is complicit in trafficking enslaved people in his early career. He is certainly privately opposed to it later in life. But what I will say, it was fortuitous for James Watt's family that slavery was not abolished in the British West Indies. And I'll come on now to the steam engines and the implications. Because the historian Eric Williams argues that capital accumulated from the West India trades underpinned the financing of the Bolton-Watt steam engine. The money came from a West India merchant bank in London, Raymond Williams via Low & Fletcher. So it seems to me, whilst Bolton and Watt seemingly had little direct involvement initially with Caribbean slavery, we can see later how their steam engine becomes intertwined, and there's important multiplier connections. What is clear though, James Watt seems to have an opposition to selling his steam engines to Caribbean planters. This is one of the shibboleths put forward by defenders of Watt. He did not sell steam engines to the Caribbean. It seems to me that James Watt and Bolton both marketed their steam engine to the Caribbean and enslavers, but it wasn't until after James Watt and Matthew Bolton retired, both of them retired in 1800, the business was subsequently managed by their sons, James Watt Jr. and Matthew Robinson Bolton, that the steam engines were then sold to the Caribbean from 1803. Historians of traced the timing. About 120 Bolton and Watt steam engines made their way to the plantations of the Caribbean and South America, British Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad, and elsewhere. Exports slowed down after about 1825. I would say that demand from the Caribbean exceeded any foreign or domestic market, with the exception of the British cotton industry, which was, of course, the leading British sector, industrial sector in Great Britain up to 1825. And in short, I mean, these steam engines allowed the greater extraction of the juice from sugar canes at a quicker pace. They required less cattle and enslaved labour to operate. So what we see is the previous dependency on wind and water power, which was backed up by cattle to drive mills and crush sugar cane, was inefficient in extracting juice, and it was expensive in terms of animal power and manpower, both free and enslaved. Given the push for the amelioration of condition of enslaved people after 1807, as well as the increasingly competitive sugar market, the historian Veront Satchel has envisioned the introduction of more reliable steam engines as the reaction of planters to international pressures, particularly the abolitionist movement. I would say there is much work to be done here on the Watts family's 19th century profiteering from Caribbean planters, as well as their control of the family memory. For it seems important to me that James Watt Jr., James Watt, the great improver's son, he profits from slavery while simultaneously commissioning glorious histories of his father, which prioritised his father's industrial career rather than his mercantile activities. What I would say is multi-generational family involvement with the slave trade and plantation slavery, as well as the control of the public memory of the family, is not uncommon, but it is unusual when the second generation is a hero of the Industrial Revolution. So I think, in the time I've got left, I'll speak about some of the wider implications here. In summary, James Watt's role, I would argue that the connections with the Caribbean and the Atlantic world have been, ignored by, both contemporary biographers and modern historians. I would say that the Caribbean was important at each of the formative stages of Watt's life. Working in his father's business, initial employment with Old College and the McFarlane Instruments, his father's underwriting of a London apprenticeship while still involved with colonial commerce. Watt later surveyed Caribbean islands for West India merchants. His inventions later, after he retired, it served to increase the efficiency of sugar estates into the 19th century. This explains why, the steam engine maximised the profits of West India planters in the death throes of Caribbean slavery up to 1834. That seems to me why the West India merchants of Glasgow established a statue in his honour in Glasgow's George Square. It stands there today as a silent yet very public reminder of the profound influence of Caribbean slavery in the development of Great Britain. So what I would say is the Trinidadian historian Eric Williams made the famous argument that slavery and its commerce powered the British Industrial Revolution. And of course, this has been hotly contested. However, to my mind, the rise of James Watt adds a new dimension here. The Atlantic trades and slavery in particular underpins his rise, and his invention subsequently drove the Industrial Revolution. In my view, James Watt personifies Great Britain's rise to the first industrial superpower, which was underpinned by the profits of slavery. This is personification of Williams's capitalism and slavery. So I'll now consider the reactions to James Watt in the context of Black Lives Matter. In 2019, that marked the commemoration of the 200th year of Watt's death and the 250th anniversary of his patent for a separate condenser. He was celebrated across the UK with almost no criticism that I can see. Few looked at or even cared about his rise in Glasgow and Scotland. I would say this was despite his family connections to slavery. They were widely known in September 2018 when the University of Glasgow Slavery Report, which I co-authored, was published. And in fact, there was even a year-long celebration of James Watt afterwards in my own institution, the University of Glasgow, which culminated in the renaming of the School of Engineering after James Watt to mark the 200th anniversary of his death. I should say that there's a bit of a disconnect between publication and findings, because my own findings on James Watt were not published until January 2020, although I had presented a couple of times. What I would say, there was enough of a prima facie case that this might have been considered. But of course, no one could have predicted, of course, COVID-19, the subsequent lockdown, and the global movement that has evolved after the murder of George Floyd in the United States on 25th of May, 2020. What has followed has been the almost widespread acknowledgement with the global Black community, and historians of race and slavery have always known the legacies of slavery and empire continue to shape lives today. and for Black and minority ethnic communities, not in a positive way. So in this way, in this environment, scholarship connecting individuals and institutions with historic connections to slavery really became a matter of great public interest, which explains the UK splash of James Watt's connections in the Times newspaper. There was a follow-up article in the Sunday Post in Scotland on the 21st of June 2020 that criticised the University of Glasgow for naming the Watt School of Engineering a year after they had already acknowledged his connections with slavery. So in response, a Glasgow media release said, and I quote, "James Watt is recognised for his technological and scientific achievements, and it is these that the university celebrates. Our website is clear in both the links that James Watt and his family had with slavery, as did so many others in the 18th century, and the move that he made to question and condemn that appalling institution." End. In other words, there is a policy in the university in place of both acknowledgement of his involvement with slavery and a celebration of his later achievements. The question is, can we celebrate? Can we disconnect both? Can we take one? Can we celebrate one with disregarding the other? That's a question for historians to debate. But I would say, just in comparison, there has been other figures in Scotland recently who have been attracted attention post Black Lives Matter. David Hume is said to have been involved in the slave trade. We know that he actually financed an investor who then went on to put money into a plantation in Grenada and the Caribbean. But as far as I can see, there is no evidence that Hume was directly involved. He was indirectly involved with plantation slavery, perhaps in a financing role. And we also know that Hume was a racist. And it seems to be one of the main reasons why the University of Edinburgh have recently renamed the Hume Tower for his infamous footnote. Another example is, of course, Henry Dundas, the late 18th century Scottish politician who infamously introduced the word gradual into William Wilberforce's motion to abolish the slave trade, effectively delaying abolition for 15 years up to 1807. And there is now a real debate in Edinburgh about Dundas's statue and how he should be commemorated. So here is the paradox. James Watt is the only individual that I've discussed here that has verifiable direct connections to the trafficking and enslaved people. The archival record proves this. Yet he is the only individual that an institution have publicly defended, like the University of Glasgow, or indeed ignored. Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh have not become part of the ongoing discussions, but they have recently updated their website to acknowledge Watt may have profited from slavery whilst they stand firm. And I quote, "There is no doubt that James Watt should be celebrated for his many achievements, without which the Industrial Revolution that followed could not have happened." Which brings me to my last point. In addition to reassessing existing statues and street names, might Black Lives Matter impact on future commemorative activities? The British fascination with anniversaryism tends to celebrate dead white men. We are now 2 centuries from the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and plantation slavery in 1834. We have another big anniversary coming in 2034. Simultaneously, historians are increasingly revealing how transatlantic slavery had and continues to have a profound influence upon the British economy and society. The Wattfest in 2019 might just become an exemplar of the British myopia, which means those enmeshed in colonial commerce are celebrated with little understanding how they came to be. But I would say, given James Watt's substantial heritage in the built environment and across the UK museum sector, this debate has some way to run as we move into an increasingly imperially aware age. Thank you.